Impeachment is a complex process that is in place in order to address what is an interelection issue. That is, the voters can replace a president every 4 years, or term limits can force a president out, but questions arise about what to do in between if there's been malfeasance, if there has been misbehavior by a president, and it has happened in our history, sometimes in ways that are addressed and other times in ways that are not. But there is a constitutional mechanism to deal with this, and that process begins in the House of Representatives, with the House approving articles of impeachment, which in legal terms is almost like an indictment. Some people conflate impeachment as the actual removal of a president, but in reality, impeachment in itself is just bringing charges against a president, a vice president, a cabinet official, a Supreme Court justice, anyone serving in the executive or judicial branches. Then, once those articles of impeachment are approved by the House by a simple majority, they move on to the Senate. The Senate then holds a trial in very odd fashion. If a Supreme Court justice is being tried, the President of the Senate, the Vice President of the United States, presides over the trial. If a president is being tried or a vice president is being tried, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court would preside. The House then essentially has prosecutors come over to the Senate and present a case, and the jury is the United States Senate. The United States Senate, by a supermajority, by a 2/3 vote, can remove the president from office, automatically elevating the vice president to the presidency. Removal, at least, has never happened in American history, and there are a variety of reasons for that, but it is in many ways the last resort for dealing with a president who has misbehaved. Impeachment has happened twice in American history. First, after President Lincoln's assassination, President Johnson came to office. He had a very combative relationship with Congress. His impeachment, like Clinton's impeachment a century and a half later, was motivated more by politics than it was by real behaviors. In Johnson's case, Congress was looking for a reason to impeach the president. They thought they could remove him from office. And they found a reason. They found a basis. President Johnson removed the Secretary of War from his position unilaterally. And it was in many ways an unprecedented action, and Congress said that it was in violation of the Constitution. Because the Secretary of War was confirmed by the Senate, Congress felt that the Senate also had to have a hand in the removal of such an officer. President Johnson disagreed. Ultimately, he was impeached. The House brought him up on impeachment charges, and by one vote, he was cleared by the Senate. His removal was prevented by the Senate. Now, that behavior has since been codified to be acceptable presidential behavior. The saying is that cabinet officials serve at the pleasure of the president. While the Senate approves that cabinet officials, the president can fire them at a whim for whatever reason he or she wants.
Fortunately for the American electorate and the American citizenry, presidential impeachment is quite infrequent when it occurs. In the 20th century, I think the most cited event of this nature was with President Nixon in the Watergate scandal. He resigned before a formal impeachment, so he avoided that. I think that impeachment can have a profound impact on the electorate. And when President Ford succeeded in office, you have to remember he was a completely unelected president. He was not elected vice president, and then he ascended to the presidency because of the Watergate scandal. And at that time, given that President Nixon was on the brink of impeachment without his resignation, his own resignation, President Ford just wanted to move on. He thought that the country that this was a very dark period in presidential history, and so he agreed to pardon the president. Many people think that he lost his election in 1976 because of the presidential pardon, and it's difficult to know. I mean, he has an argument that if there had been a formal conviction process, that may have torn the country apart even more. But there was questions, and there was congressional testimony and hearings with President Ford questioning his intent to pardon or his pardon and wondering if there was some sort of collusion between himself and President Nixon. And he was very adamant about saying there was no collusion, that he felt that this was the best decision for the country and the best way to move forward.
For President Clinton, his own misbehavior, personal misbehavior, led to charges of perjury and obstruction of justice. This was after many years of a Republican Congress trying to find something to use against President Clinton. His actual behaviors, particularly the behaviors in question upon which he was impeached, were questionable, whether they rose to the level of impeachment or whether they were actual crimes at all. And at the end of the day, President Clinton was impeached by a Republican-controlled House and cleared by the Senate, not just by one vote like his predecessor, President Johnson, but with plenty of breathing room.
My sense about impeachments, at least in my own reading of the sequencing of American history, is that they interestingly have occurred at intervals where we are in a post-crisis period, and that they are an adjunct to these broader institutional or political forces that the American people have given energy to restore constitutional balance after a period of what Clinton Rossiter, the famous historian, called constitutional dictatorship embedded in the presidency or invested in the presidency. So with Abraham Lincoln, you've got this unbelievable manifestation of presidential power apart from what's in the Constitution. And then after the war is over, almost immediately, Andrew Johnson comes in and suffers for attempting to carry on Lincoln's presidency into the post-war period. I think Nixon, to some extent, is a corollary case, again, because you're beginning to see post-Vietnam pressures, and there's also a reaction to Nixon, in Nixon's case, to what Arthur Schlesinger Jr. called the imperial presidency, that Nixon was attempting to take vast powers even above and beyond what a legitimate crisis president might need, and it was the American people's way of right-sizing the institution.